My son put the land where his mother is buried under contract. 40 acres for a $15,000 advance he'd already spent. I found out from a stranger's photo online. Then the developer stood in my driveway, smiled, and said, "These things have a way of resolving themselves, one way or another." He saw a 69-year-old farmer in flannel. He didn't know I'd spent 40 years reading men like him in boardrooms. I didn't shout. I made one phone call. Then the storm came. My son is willing to sell the plot of land where his mother is buried for just $15,000. My son told his father-in-law our land was basically already sold, while I sat right there at the table. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just finished my coffee and made one phone call. 2 weeks later, the man who tried to steal our orchard was the one begging for mercy. I found out my son was selling the land my wife and I built with our bare hands. The same way most fathers find out things these days, from a stranger's photograph on the internet. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary evening where nothing is supposed to happen. And I was sitting in my recliner with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, when my neighbor, Carl Jensen, tagged me in a comment. A real estate listing had appeared in the local buy and sell group, a photograph of the North Field, my North Field, the one my wife, Margaret, used to walk through every September with a basket over her arm, checking the Honeycrisp trees for ripeness before the frost came. The sign in the photograph read, "Under contract." Bold red letters over a white background staked into the ground, not 30 feet from where the old fence line met the county road. I read the caption twice. Then I read it a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. 40 acres of prime orchard land zoned for future development, sale pending. There was a phone number for a company called Summit Ridge Development. There was no mention of my name. I did not call my son screaming. I want that understood clearly because I know how these stories usually go. I did not throw the phone across the room. I did not drive to his house with my jaw clenched and my hands shaking on the wheel. I sat there in my chair for a long while, and I let the coffee finish going cold. And I thought about the day Margaret and I signed the papers for this place 38 years ago, back when Caleb was still small enough to ride on my shoulders through the rows. We had put everything into that orchard. Every dollar we did not spend on groceries or on Caleb's shoes went into new trees, into irrigation lines, into a hand-pump well that I dug myself the summer I turned 31. Margaret used to say the orchard was our third child, the one that never talked back and never grew up and left. She was buried under the old oak at the edge of the property, the one tree on the whole 40 acres that never bore fruit and never needed to, because its job was just to stand there and watch over everything else. I set the phone down on the arm of the chair, and I sat with the silence for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through what was left of the September leaves, and somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. I thought about calling Caleb right then. I thought about a lot of things I might say to him, sharp things, the kind of things a man says when he has been wounded in a place he thought was armored. But I have lived 69 years, and one thing those years taught me is that the first thing you feel is rarely the thing worth saying out loud. So I got up instead. I put on my work coat, the canvas one with the torn pocket that Margaret always said she was going to mend and never did. And I drove out to the orchard in the dark, my headlights cutting thin yellow lines through the rows of trees I had planted with my own hands. I parked near the old oak, and I walked the last stretch on foot, because some places deserve to be approached slowly. The ground was cold under my boots. I stood there a long moment, looking at the small stone marker with her name on it, worn soft at the edges now from 38 winters. And I said the only thing that felt true. "I made you a promise, Margaret," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I expected, cracking on her name the way it always did when I was alone enough to let it. "I told you this land would still be ours when I was old and gray, and that our grandchildren would eat fruit off trees you and I planted together. I don't know what our son thinks he's doing, but I intend to keep that promise, no matter what it costs me." The wind answered with nothing but the sound of dry leaves scraping against each other, and somewhere far off, an owl called out twice and went quiet. I drove home that night, and I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in front of me, turning it over in my hands like it was something dangerous. And I thought about how a man is supposed to confront his only son. Not with rage. Rage is cheap, and it never once in my life bought back anything that mattered. I thought instead about clarity, about looking Caleb in the eye and asking him plainly why the boy I raised to respect where he came from had signed his name to a stranger's contract without ever once picking up the phone to call his father. At 6 a.m, with the sky still gray and the coffee maker just starting to gurgle, I called him. "Caleb," I said when he answered, groggy and confused. "I need you to come out to the orchard today. There's something we need to discuss, face to face." There was a pause on the line, long enough that I knew, with the certainty a man only gets after decades of reading his own child, that he already understood exactly what this was about. "Dad," he said finally, his voice careful, testing the ground. "Is everything okay?" "Come out here, son," I said. "We'll talk when you're standing in front of me." I hung up before he could ask anything else, and I sat there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the coffee maker finish its work, and I waited for the sound of his truck in the driveway. The sound of his truck door slamming shut carried all the way into the kitchen, sharp and final, like a period at the end of a sentence neither of us had spoken yet. I heard his boots on the porch steps slower than usual, dragging a little, the way a man walks when he already knows he is about to be caught in something. I did not get up from the table. I sat there with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone lukewarm an hour ago, and I let him come to me. Caleb pushed open the screen door and stood in the frame for a moment, his eyes moving around the kitchen like he was looking for somewhere safe to land them. Anywhere but on me. He was still wearing yesterday's shirt. His hair was uncombed. I could tell he had not slept much either. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, the way it used to when he was 9 years old and had broken something he was too afraid to admit to. "Sit down, son," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, quieter than the anger I had been carrying all night. Because somewhere between the orchard and this table, the anger had burned itself down into something heavier and sadder. "I think you know why I called you out here." He pulled out the chair across from me, the same chair he had sat in since he was a boy, and lowered himself into it, like the chair might give out under the weight of what he was about to say. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed. A truck passed on the county road outside, its engine fading into the distance. "I saw the sign," I said finally, because I was not going to let him make me drag it out of him piece by piece. 40 acres, under contract, Summit Ridge Development. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands folded on the table in front of him, and I watched something in his shoulders collapse inward. The posture of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that the moment of setting it down feels almost like relief. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" I asked. "After the closing, after the bulldozers were already parked in the north field." "Dad, it's not—" He stopped himself, started over. "It's not what you think. I wasn't trying to steal it from you. I needed the money, and Grady made it sound simple. He said the paperwork could move fast, that nobody would even have to know until it was already done. And by then, it would just be a formality to get your signature on the deed transfer. I set the mug down harder than I meant to. The sound of it against the wood table was louder than I expected, and Caleb flinched like I had raised a hand to him, which I never had. Not once in his whole life. A formality, I repeated. Son, your mother is buried on that land. I dug that well with my own 2 hands the summer before you were born. Every tree in that north field I planted with her walking beside me, and you are sitting here telling me that my signature on the deed was going to be a formality? I know how it sounds, he said, his voice rising, now defensive, the way it always did when shame started curdling into anger. But you don't know what it's like, Dad. You don't know the pressure I'm under. Danielle's family, they're not like us. They expect things. New cars, a bigger house, trips to places I can't afford on a foreman's salary, and I keep telling myself I can catch up, I can get ahead. But I never do. And then Grady Owens shows up out of nowhere, talking about how much this land is worth, and it felt like... He stopped, pressed his palms flat against the table. It felt like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was praying. I looked at my son for a long moment, and underneath the frustration, underneath the ache of betrayal, I felt something else stir, something closer to grief. Not for the land, for him, for the man he had become. Somewhere between the boy who used to ride on my shoulders through these very rows and the man now sitting across from me, willing to sell his mother's grave to keep pace with people who would never respect him, no matter how much he gave them. That land isn't mine to sell either, son, I said quietly. It's your mother's. It always was. I just happen to still be standing on it. Caleb's eyes filled, and for a moment I thought he might finally break, might finally let the truth of what he had almost done settle into him the way it needed to. But then his jaw set again, and the wall went back up, the same wall I had watched him build brick by brick since Danielle came into his life. I'm not signing anything without your consent, he said, standing abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I never was going to. I was going to talk to you eventually, I swear it. I just needed time to figure out how. You had time, I said. You had every dinner, every phone call, every Sunday I asked you to come out here and help me prune the trees. You had all the time in the world, Caleb. You just didn't want to spend it telling me the truth. He did not answer that. He could not. He stood there for a moment, with his hand on the back of the chair, and then he turned and walked toward the door without another word. His boots heavy on the floorboards, heavier than they had sounded coming in. I watched him go through the screen door, watched him cross the porch and head down the steps toward his truck. And just before he reached the door handle, I saw him pull his phone from his pocket, glance down at the screen, and go still. The light from it caught his face in the gray morning, and even from the kitchen window, I could see his expression change, the way a man's face changes when a message arrives that he has been both waiting for and dreading in equal measure. He did not look back at the house. He climbed into the truck, sat there a long moment without starting the engine, and I understood, watching him, that whatever was on that screen was only the beginning of what this day was going to cost all of us. The fog had not yet burned off the low fields when I saw the car turn in off the county road. A black sedan moving slower than it needed to, as though its driver wanted to be seen arriving. I was out by the equipment shed, checking the pressure on an irrigation line that had been running weak all week, and I straightened up when the car pulled to a stop near the gate and a man in a gray suit stepped out, smoothing his jacket with one hand before he started walking toward me. He moved across the wet grass, like a man who had never once in his life ruined a good pair of shoes. And I suppose that told me most of what I needed to know about him before he ever opened his mouth. Mr. Whitfield, he said, extending a hand while he was still several paces away, closing the distance with the kind of confident stride salesmen practice in front of mirrors. Grady Owens, I represent Summit Ridge Development. I believe your son may have mentioned me. I looked at the hand for a moment before I took it, and his grip was firm in the practiced way of a man who has shaken 1,000 hands and learned exactly how much pressure makes people trust him. He mentioned you, I said, though not in those words. If that landed anywhere, he did not let it show. He smiled the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes, the smile of a man selling something he has never once believed in himself. And he glanced past me toward the rows of apple trees stretching out under the gray morning sky. Beautiful piece of land, he said. My grandfather used to farm up near Traverse City. I have a real appreciation for what you've built here. Then you'll understand why it isn't for sale, I said. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and cold, gone almost before I registered it. He nodded slowly, as though considering my words with great respect, though I had lived long enough to recognize the particular patience of a man who has simply decided to wait you out. I understand this is emotional, he said. Land like this, family history, all of that matters. But I want you to understand what we're offering isn't just a number, Mr. Whitfield. We're offering your son a way out from under a situation that frankly could get complicated if it isn't handled correctly. I felt something tighten in my chest, quiet and dangerous the way it used to years ago whenever a man tried to talk down to me on a job site. Assuming my flannel shirt and calloused hands meant I would not notice when he was maneuvering me. What situation would that be? I asked. Grady's smile widened just slightly, and he reached into his jacket, producing a folded document that he did not offer to me, but held instead almost casually, like a card he was choosing not to play just yet. Your son signed a preliminary agreement with our firm, he said. There's language in there regarding shared ownership, regarding good faith negotiations. I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Whitfield, but I've seen deals like this get tied up in court for years when a co-owner refuses to cooperate. Legal fees, liens, it gets messy. And messy is expensive for everyone involved, including a man your age on a fixed income trying to hold on to 40 acres by himself. The threat was wrapped in silk, but I had spent 40 years reading balance sheets and boardrooms, long before I ever became just a man in flannel with dirt under his fingernails. And I recognized the threat when one was standing in front of me, however politely it was dressed. Mr. Owens, I said, keeping my voice level. I dug the well on this property with my own 2 hands. I buried my wife under that oak tree at the edge of the field. I have signed exactly nothing, and I don't intend to start now because a man in an expensive suit is uncomfortable standing on grass. For the first time, something genuine passed across his face. A flash of irritation quickly smoothed back into professional calm. I'd hate for this to become adversarial, he said. Then I'd suggest you get back in your car, I said, and give my son's phone number a rest. He held my gaze a moment longer, and I watched him make some internal calculation, weighing whether pushing further would gain him anything today. Whatever the math told him, he folded the document back into his jacket and offered another smile. Thinner now, colder. You have my card if you reconsider, he said, though he had never given me one, and I understood that as its own kind of message. These things have a way of resolving themselves, Mr. Whitfield, one way or another. He turned and walked back toward the sedan unhurried, and I stood there, watching until the car pulled back onto the county road and disappeared behind a rise in the land. The fog was starting to lift off the low fields, and somewhere behind me, a crow called out twice from the branches of the old oak, sharp and insistent, like it was trying to warn me of something I could not yet see. I spent the rest of the day working the north field, pruning deadwood from the rows Margaret and I had planted the second year we owned this place. and I told myself the unease sitting in my stomach was nothing more than an old man's imagination running ahead of the facts. But that night, long after I had gone to bed, and the house had settled into the particular silence of a farmhouse in late September, I woke to a sound outside I could not place. It was not the wind. I have lived here long enough to know every voice the wind uses across these fields, and this was something else. Something metal, something deliberate, coming from the direction of the orchard fence line. I lay there in the dark for a long moment, listening, my heart beating harder than it should have for a man simply lying in his own bed. And then, somewhere out past the barn, I heard it again, closer this time, and I understood with a cold certainty settling into my chest that whatever Grady Owens had meant by things resolving themselves one way or another, it had already begun. I did not go outside that night. I want to be honest about that, because there is no use pretending I was braver than I was. I lay there in the dark, listening until the sound stopped. And then I lay there longer still, listening to nothing, which was somehow worse. When the gray light finally came through the curtains, I got up, made coffee I did not drink, and walked out toward the fence line with a flashlight I no longer needed and a knot in my stomach that told me exactly what I was going to find before I found it. The south fence, the one that ran along the edge of the older trees, the ones Margaret had named after her sisters back when the kids were small enough to think that was funny, had been cut clean through in 3 places. Not knocked down by a fallen branch, not worn loose by weather. Cut. The wire ends curled outward, sharp and deliberate, the kind of damage that comes from bolt cutters, in a steady hand, not from anything the wind could have done in a single night. I crouched down and ran my fingers along one of the cut ends, feeling the clean edge of it, and something cold settled into my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. Beyond the fence, in the row of trees closest to the break, I found the second thing, and this one turned my stomach in a way the fence had not. 6 trees, maybe 7, had been girdled, a ring of bark stripped clean around each trunk, deep enough to reach the cambium layer. I had been farming long enough to know exactly what that meant. A tree girdled that way does not die quickly. It dies slowly, over a season, sometimes 2, starving from the inside, while it still looks green on the outside to anyone who does not know to look closer. Whoever did this had not wanted a fast, obvious kind of damage. They had wanted something quiet, something that would not raise alarm right away, something a man might not even notice until the leaves started yellowing in July. And by then, it would already be too late to save the tree. I stood there in the cold, looking down the row at 6 trees that Margaret and I had planted, the same spring Caleb turned 4, and I felt something in my chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but sat somewhere heavier between the two, a feeling I had not carried in a long time. I had felt it once before, decades ago, standing in a hospital hallway, being told there was nothing more the doctors could do. It was the particular fury of watching something you love be killed, slowly, deliberately, by someone who does not have to watch it happen. I called the county sheriff's office from the kitchen phone because my hands were shaking too badly to trust them with the buttons on my cell. Deputy Ray Coleman came out within the hour, a young man I had known since he was in diapers, his father having worked the co-op grain elevator for 30 years before he retired. Ray walked the fence line with me, took photographs of the girdled trees, wrote everything down in a small notebook with the careful seriousness of a man determined to do his job right. "I'll be straight with you, Earl," he said, standing at the edge of the row, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Without a witness or a camera, there's not much I can charge anybody with. Kids do this kind of thing sometimes out of boredom. Could be that." "Kids don't girdle trees with a knife, Ray," I said. "They don't know how, and they wouldn't bother. This was done by somebody who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly how long it would take to matter. Ray did not argue with me. He closed his notebook, slowly glanced back toward the road, where a black sedan had passed twice already that morning, once heading east and once heading west. Neither time slowing down, but neither time in any particular hurry either. "You got any idea who'd want to hurt your operation like this?" he asked, though I could see in his face that he already suspected the shape of an answer, even if he could not yet put a name to it. I told him about Grady Owens, about Summit Ridge Development, about the veiled words in my driveway the morning before, about things resolving themselves one way or another. Ray wrote it all down, though I could tell from the set of his jaw that a suit and a smile and a vague threat were not going to be enough to get a warrant for anything. "I'll ask around," he said. "See if anybody from that company's been seen out this way at night. In the meantime, Earl, you might think about putting up some cameras. Cheap enough these days, and it'd give us something to work with if this happens again." After he left, I walked the rest of the fence line alone, checking every tree in the affected row, cataloging the damage in my head, the way I used to catalog structural stress on a bridge deck, back when precision was the only thing standing between a project succeeding and a project killing somebody. 6 trees girdled, 3 fence breaks. No witnesses, no cameras, no proof of anything beyond a rich man's polite threat and a farmer's word against it. It was near the last tree in the row, half buried under a scattering of fallen leaves, that I found the folded piece of paper. It was ordinary notebook paper, damp from the overnight dew, and when I unfolded it carefully, I found a series of numbers written in pencil, a date and a single word beneath them that I did not understand at the time, but that would come to mean a great deal in the weeks ahead. Phase 2. I stood there in the cold morning light, holding a scrap of paper that told me almost nothing and everything at once. And I understood with a certainty that settled deep into my bones that whatever had happened to my fence and my trees was not the end of something. It was the beginning. I drove into town that same afternoon and bought 4 wireless cameras from the hardware store on Main Street. The kind with motion sensors and enough battery life to run through a Michigan winter without needing constant attention. The young man behind the counter, Danny Ostrander, whose father used to buy seed corn from the co-op alongside me 30 years back, helped me pick out the right models, and did not ask why a man my age suddenly needed to watch his own property like it was a bank vault. I appreciated that about him. Some things a man does not want to explain twice in one day. I spent the rest of the afternoon mounting them along the fence line and near the equipment shed, my knees protesting every time I climbed the stepladder, my breath coming shorter than it used to when I was younger. And this kind of work did not remind my body of its age. By the time the sun dropped low behind the tree line, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise, I had 4 small black eyes watching over what was left of the orchard. And I told myself that was enough for one day. It was not enough, of course. Nothing ever is when a man is trying to hold together something bigger than himself with wire and prayer and a hardware store camera system. But I did not know that yet, standing there in the fading light, brushing the dirt from my knees, and thinking for just a moment that maybe I had done something useful. The phone rang while I was washing up at the kitchen sink, and I saw Caleb's name on the screen, and felt my stomach tighten before I even answered it. We had not spoken since he walked out of this kitchen 2 days before, and something in the timing of the call so soon after everything else told me this was not going to be a conversation about apologies. "Dad?" His voice came through thin and fast, the words tumbling over each other in a way I had not heard from him since he was a teenager, caught doing something he should not have been doing. "Dad, I need you to listen to me for a second. I'm not asking you to change your mind about the land. I just need to explain something." "I'm listening. I said, drying my hands slowly on the dish towel, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Summit Ridge gave me an advance, he said. Before you found out, before any of this. Grady called it earnest money, said it was standard practice, a show of good faith while the paperwork went through. I used some of it to cover the down payment on the truck, some of it on bills that were piling up. I thought it was already spent, already done, that it didn't matter anymore, because the deal was going through anyway. I felt the floor of the conversation shift under me, the way it does when a man realizes the story he has been told is only half the story, and the missing half is always worse than the part he already knew. "How much, Caleb?" I said. It was not really a question. It was a demand dressed as one. 15,000, he said, and his voice cracked on the second word, the way it used to when he was small and had broken something precious and was trying to explain it before the tears started. "Dad, they're saying that since you won't sign, since the deal's falling apart, I have to pay it back. All of it. Within 30 days, or they're threatening legal action, some kind of breach of good faith clause. I didn't even understand when I signed it." I closed my eyes and pressed my palm flat against the cool countertop, steadying myself against a wave of something that was not quite anger and not quite pity, but moved through me the same way both of those things do, heavy and hot at once. "You signed something you didn't read," I said quietly. "I know," he said. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I heard something in his voice that sounded less like defensiveness and more like the beginning of genuine fear. "I know, Dad. I was stupid. I was desperate, and Grady made it sound so easy. And now I don't have $15,000, and Danielle doesn't know yet, and if her parents find out, I've put us in this kind of hole." He stopped himself, and in the silence that followed, I could hear him breathing hard on the other end. The sound of a man standing at the edge of a hole he had dug himself, and only just now understanding how deep it went. "I'm not going to bail you out of this one by signing that land away," I said. "I need you to hear that clearly, son. I love you, and none of what's happening changes that. But I will not sell your mother's grave to solve a problem that started with a truck you didn't need and a man who saw you coming from a mile off." "I'm not asking you to sign anything," Caleb said, his voice tight. "I'm asking you to understand why I did what I did. That's all. I know it doesn't fix anything." I stood there in the kitchen, looking out the window toward the darkening rows of trees, toward the fence line, where 4 small cameras were now standing guard against a threat I still did not fully understand. And I thought about the scrap of paper folded in my jacket pocket. 2 words written in pencil that I had not yet mentioned to anyone but Ray Coleman. Phase 2. "Caleb," I said slowly, "this man Grady Owens, has he mentioned anything about the fence line? About the trees?" There was a pause, confused, genuine. "The fence? No, why would he—" "Dad, what does the fence have to do with any of this?" I did not answer that directly. Not yet. Because I did not have enough to say it plainly without sounding like a frightened old man chasing shadows. But standing there in my kitchen, listening to my son's voice shake with a fear that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the debt he had walked himself into, I understood that whatever Summit Ridge Development wanted from this family, they were not simply negotiating for a piece of property anymore. They were closing in from 2 directions at once, and my son, whether he knew it or not, had already become one of their tools. I did not witness what happened in my son's apartment that night. I want to be honest about that too, because a man telling this story owes it to whoever is listening not to pretend he saw things he did not see. But Caleb told me most of it himself weeks later, sitting at this same kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, the same way mine had been that first morning. And Danielle filled in the rest, quietly, the way people do when they are finally ready to stop protecting a version of events that never served anyone. So I tell it now the way they told it to me, because I believe it happened close enough to this. Caleb had not said a word about the $15,000 when he walked through the door that evening. He told me later that he sat down at their small kitchen table, the one Danielle had found secondhand and refinished herself the year they got married, and he stared at a plate of dinner going cold in front of him, until she finally set her fork down and asked him what was wrong. He told her everything then. The advance from Summit Ridge, the 30-day deadline, the fact that his father had refused to sign, and that the debt, real and immediate, now belonged entirely to the two of them. Danielle did not respond right away, he said. She sat there for a long moment, absorbing it. And then she asked the question that Caleb told me haunted him more than anything Grady Owens had ever said. "Is this the man you want our children to remember you as?" He did not have an answer for her. Not at first. He told me he sat there, staring at the cold plate of food, thinking about his mother, though he had not spoken her name aloud in that apartment in longer than he could remember. And something about the question cracked open a door he had been holding shut for months. "I keep telling myself I'm doing this for us," he told Danielle, according to what he later confessed to me. "For our future. For a life where we're not always scraping by, always feeling like we're one bad month away from losing everything." "And selling your father's land? Your mother's grave? That's the life you want to build that future on?" Danielle asked him. He said her voice was not cruel when she said it. It was tired, and it was sad, and somehow that was worse than if she had shouted. He told me he thought about Margaret, then about the handful of times Danielle had met her before the cancer took her. About a Thanksgiving early in their relationship, when Margaret had pulled Danielle aside in the kitchen and told her, in that quiet, direct way she had, that family land was not an asset. It was a promise passed down, meant to outlast whoever was foolish enough to think they owned it outright. "She told me that too," Danielle said to him that night when he repeated the memory aloud. "Do you remember? She said the orchard doesn't belong to your family. Your family belongs to the orchard." Caleb told me he had forgotten that until she said it back to him. And hearing it in her voice, in the apartment they had built together, out of second-hand furniture and careful budgets, it landed differently than it ever had at his mother's table. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted to her. "I don't know how to pay back $15,000 I don't have. And I don't know how to face my father again after what I almost did." Danielle reached across the table and took his hand, he told me. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. He said the apartment was quiet in a way it had not been in months. The particular quiet that comes after two people have finally stopped performing for each other and started telling the truth. "Then maybe the first step," she said finally, "is admitting you were wrong. Not to me, to him." Caleb told me he sat with that for a long time, turning it over, feeling the shape of it settle into something he had been avoiding for weeks. He said he thought about calling me that night, right then, standing in the kitchen with Danielle's hand still resting over his. He said he even picked up his phone once, scrolled to my name, and set it back down again. Not out of fear, but because he did not yet know what he would say. And he did not want to call his father with nothing but an apology, and no plan behind it. It was in that moment, phone still resting on the table between them, screen dark, that it lit up again, on its own, buzzing once against the wood, with the particular insistence of a call that intends to be answered. Grady Owens. Caleb told me he stared at the screen for a long moment before he picked it up. Danielle watching him across the table, her hand tightening slightly around his. "Caleb?" Grady said when he answered, his voice as smooth and unhurried as it had been the morning he stood in my driveway. "I wanted to follow up personally. I understand there's been some hesitation on your end regarding the repayment timeline." "I need more time," Caleb said. My father isn't going to sign. You know that now. I do know that, Grady said, and Caleb told me there was something new in his voice, then something colder underneath the politeness, like a man finally setting down a mask he had grown tired of wearing. Which is why I'm going to be direct with you, Caleb. The 30 days I mentioned earlier. I'm afraid that timeline has moved up considerably. Caleb told me his stomach dropped before Grady even finished the sentence. Some animal instinct in him already understanding that whatever came next was going to be worse than anything that had come before it. How much time do I have? He asked, and Danielle's grip on his hand tightened harder still. You have until Friday, Grady said. Storm's coming in this weekend, and I'd hate for anything else to happen to that land while we're all still trying to sort out these details. He hung up before Caleb could respond, and my son sat there in his kitchen, the phone still warm in his hand, understanding for the first time that the fence line and the girdled trees had never been separate from this conversation at all. They had been the same threat, delivered in two different languages, and now the deadline had a face, and it had a storm attached to it, and it was closing fast. By the middle of that week, I had stopped sleeping the way a man is supposed to sleep. I would lie in bed, listening for sounds that were not there, and when I did drift off, I dreamed of cut wire and girdled bark of a black sedan idling somewhere just out of sight. I was not eating much either. Margaret used to say a man could tell how heavy his burdens were by how much weight he'd lost carrying them. And by Thursday morning, looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I understood exactly what she meant. I drove into Millbrook that afternoon, not for groceries, not for hardware, but because I needed to sit somewhere that still felt steady. The church sat at the corner of Main and 3rd, the same white clapboard building it had been since before I was born. Its steeple a little crooked now from a windstorm 2 decades back that nobody had ever bothered to fully straighten. I found Pastor Thomas in the small office behind the sanctuary, going through hymnal selections for Sunday. And he looked up when I knocked on the open door frame, setting his reading glasses down on the desk without hesitation. "Earl," he said, and something in the way he said my name told me he had already heard some version of what was happening out at the orchard. Millbrook was a small town, and small towns carry news the way rivers carry silt, slow and constant and impossible to stop once it starts moving. "Sit down. You look like a man who hasn't slept in days." "That obvious," I said, lowering myself into the chair across from his desk. The same chair I had sat in 30-some years ago when Margaret and I came to arrange a wedding date, and again decades later when I came to arrange her funeral. "It's obvious to a man who's known you 40 years, Thomas said, folding his hands on the desk. "Tell me what's going on." So I told him. All of it. The sign in the field, the confession in my kitchen, the man in the gray suit and his soft threats, the cut fence and the girdled trees, the scrap of paper with 2 words on it that I still did not fully understand. Thomas listened without interrupting, the way he always had, the way that had made him a good pastor for as long as I had known him. And when I finally finished, the office was quiet, except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. "You're carrying a lot, Earl," he said finally. "More than most men carry alone." "I don't feel like I have much choice," I said. "Somebody has to protect that land. Margaret trusted me with it." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment, with the particular patience he had always carried. The kind that made a man feel like he had all the time in the world, even when he clearly did not. "Can I tell you something I've come to believe, after all these years of standing in front of people during their worst days?" he said. "We like to think faith is about winning, about God stepping in at the last moment to fix everything, to make the wicked lose and the righteous walk away untouched. But that's not what I've seen, Earl. Not in Scripture, and not in this life. Sometimes God doesn't ask us to win the fight. He asks us to stay in it, to keep showing up, keep being faithful, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere deep in my chest. I don't know if I have the strength for that, I admitted, and it cost me something to say it out loud, a confession I had not even allowed myself in the privacy of my own kitchen. I'm 69 years old, Thomas. I buried my wife. I've spent 5 days watching cameras and waiting for whatever comes next. And some nights, I wonder if I even have the right to keep fighting this hard, for a piece of land, when maybe the Lord is trying to tell me it's time to let go. Thomas shook his head slowly, and there was no judgment in it, only a kind of gentle certainty that had steadied me through harder days than this one. There's a difference between letting go and being pushed, he said. Letting go is peace. What's happening to you out there is an assault, Earl dressed up in a suit and a smile, but an assault all the same. You're not being called to surrender that orchard. You're being called to protect what was entrusted to you, and to do it without letting the fear and the anger turn you into something you're not. We sat together a while longer, and eventually he asked if I would pray with him. And I said yes, because there is a particular kind of relief in kneeling beside another man and letting someone else carry the words for a moment when you cannot find your own. He prayed for wisdom for me, for protection over the land, for softening in Caleb's heart, and for strength in mine. And when he said Margaret's name near the end, asking that her memory continue to guide the family she had left behind, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in nearly a week. I left the church a little after 4, the sky already beginning to gray over with the particular heaviness that comes before weather moves in. And I drove home with the truck radio on low, half listening, my mind still turning over everything Thomas had said. The forecast came on somewhere past the county line, the announcer's voice steady and practiced, rattling off pressure systems and wind speeds the way meteorologists do, treating catastrophe and inconvenience with the same even tone. I did not think much of it until I caught the words late-season storm and rapid intensification. And then, clear as anything, this weekend. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the county road, gravel crunching under the tires, and sat there listening as the announcer described a system moving in off the lake, gathering strength faster than models had predicted. Expected to make landfall with heavy rain and damaging winds sometime Friday night into Saturday morning. Friday night. I sat there for a long moment with the engine idling and the radio still talking, my hands resting on the wheel, and I thought about 40 acres of trees just days from harvest, about fence lines already weakened, about a man in a gray suit who had told me things had a way of resolving themselves one way or another. I did not yet know that somewhere across town my son was staring at his own phone, hearing the same word from a very different voice. But sitting there on the shoulder of that county road, watching the sky darken early over fields that had fed 3 generations of my family, I understood with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest that whatever was coming this weekend was going to ask more of all of us than any storm ever had before. Friday morning came in gray and still, the particular stillness that farmers learn to distrust more than any wind. I had lived on this land long enough to read weather in the color of the sky before any forecaster ever confirmed it. And everything about that morning told me the radio had not been exaggerating. I spent the early hours doing what any man does before a storm of that size. I moved the tractor into the equipment shed. I checked the tie-downs on the loose panels of the old barn roof, tightened what I could and accepted what I could not. I walked the orchard one final time, running my hand along trunks that had stood through 40 winters, and I found myself talking to the trees the way I sometimes talk to Margaret. Quiet words meant for no one but myself and whoever else might be listening. "Hold on tonight," I said. "Just one more night. I'm not ready to lose you yet." By early afternoon, the wind had already started to shift, gusting harder out of the northwest, carrying the particular metallic smell that precedes heavy rain. I checked the cameras one last time, made certain the batteries were fresh, though some part of me understood that whatever was coming tonight would not need cutting tools or bolt cutters to do its damage. The storm itself was about to do Summit Ridge's work for them, and there was nothing Ray Coleman or any camera could do about that. I did not know it yet, working alone in that wind. But nearly 40 miles away, in a glass office tower overlooking the interstate, my son was sitting in a leather chair across from Grady Owens, staring down at a stack of papers that would decide the shape of everything. Caleb told me about that room later, in more detail than I ever wanted. But I understand now why he needed to say it all out loud, the way a man needs to speak a nightmare aloud in daylight before it loses its grip on him. He said the office smelled like new carpet and expensive coffee, and that Grady sat across the desk from him with the same practiced calm he had carried standing in my driveway, sliding a pen across the polished wood, as though it weighed nothing at all. "This is simple, Caleb," Grady told him. "You sign here, we release the property from the family lien dispute through eminent domain partnership language. Your father's objection becomes a formality the courts will resolve later. And your debt disappears tonight. No more 30 days, no more phone calls. You walk out of here a free man." Caleb told me he sat there staring at the signature line for what felt like a very long time, the pen resting in his hand, heavier than any pen had ever felt before. He thought about the fence, he said, about the 6 trees dying slow deaths a mile from where he now sat. He thought about the scrap of paper his father had mentioned on the phone. 2 words that still made no sense to him. Phase 2. And something about sitting in this glass tower, about to sign his name to language he barely understood, made those 2 words suddenly feel less like a mystery and more like a warning he had ignored. He thought about Danielle sitting alone in their apartment, waiting to hear what he decided. He thought about the question she had asked him at their kitchen table, the one that had followed him every hour since. "Is this the man you want our children to remember you as?" And he thought he told me about his mother. Not in some vague, sentimental way, but specifically, vividly, the particular memory of her hands stained faintly with the tannin of apple skins every September, showing him as a boy how to tell a ripe Honeycrisp from one that needed another week on the branch. He said he could hear her voice as clearly in that office as if she were standing beside him. Outside the glass windows behind Grady's desk, the storm had already begun rolling in off the lake. Dark clouds pressing low against the horizon. The first fat drops of rain starting to streak sideways across the glass. "The weather's turning," Grady said, glancing toward the window with mild irritation, the way a man notices an inconvenience rather than a warning. "I'd sign quickly if I were you. Roads out toward your father's place are going to be a mess tonight." Caleb told me that was the moment something shifted in him hearing Grady mention my place, my orchard, so casually, so certain that geography and weather were simply obstacles to be managed rather than a home worth protecting. He picked up the pen. He told me his hand was shaking. He held it there, hovering just above the signature line, close enough that the tip nearly touched the paper, close enough that one small motion, one moment of exhaustion or fear or simple surrender would have ended everything. And then he said, the lights in the office flickered once, dimmed, and went out entirely, plunging the room into gray stormlight, the hum of the building's electricity dying all at once as the first true gust of wind slammed against the windows, hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. In the sudden darkness, Caleb told me he could hear his own heartbeat louder than anything else in the room. And somewhere behind that sound, quieter but unmistakable, he heard his mother's voice one more time. The same words she had told Danielle years before. At a Thanksgiving table, neither of them had forgotten. The orchard doesn't belong to your family. Your family belongs to the orchard. He set the pen down. I did not know, standing out in that wind, with rain already needling sideways against my face, that 40 miles away my son was setting down a pen he had come within an inch of using to sign away everything his mother and I had built. I only knew what was in front of me, which by 8 o'clock that evening had become considerable. The storm arrived faster than the forecast had promised, the way storms off the lake sometimes do, gathering strength over open water and slamming into land with an intensity that makes a man feel very small very quickly. I had lived through plenty of Michigan storms in 69 years, but there was something different about this one. A violence to it that made the old barn groan on its foundation and set every loose board in the equipment shed rattling like teeth. I was out checking the north fence line when the wind shifted hard, swinging around from the northwest and picking up speed all at once. The kind of gust that does not announce itself so much as arrive, shoving me sideways 2 full steps before I caught my footing. Rain came with it, cold and driving, soaking through my canvas coat within minutes, running down the back of my collar in a way that made my whole body clench against the chill. I should have gone inside then. I knew that even as I kept walking. But the young trees, the ones we had planted only 4 seasons back near the eastern edge of the property, had never weathered anything like this, and I could not make myself abandon them to the storm without at least trying to stake the ones most likely to snap. The lightning came in sheets now. Not single strikes, but long, rolling flashes that lit the whole orchard silver blue for half a second at a time, throwing the shadows of branches across the ground like reaching hands. Thunder followed close behind, close enough that I felt it in my chest before I heard it. A deep, concussive roll that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I worked as fast as my knees would let me, driving stakes into rain-softened ground, tying young trunks with whatever rope and wire I had brought, my hands numb and clumsy in the cold. Somewhere behind me, in the darkness, beyond the reach of my flashlight, I heard a crack that was not thunder, a deep, splintering groan that every farmer learns to recognize and fear. The sound of a large branch, or worse, a whole tree, losing its fight with the wind. I turned toward the sound just as another flash of lightning lit the sky, and in that half-second of silver light, I saw it clearly. One of the old maples along the property line, easily 80 years standing, had begun to lean at an angle no tree should lean, its root system tearing loose from saturated ground with a sound like the earth itself groaning in protest. It was not near me. Not yet. But it stood close to the equipment shed, close to the generator I had set up that afternoon to keep the cameras running through the outage that had already darkened half the county, and closer still to the path I would need to take to get back to the house. I stood there for a moment, soaked through, my flashlight beam trembling in a hand gone stiff with cold, and I felt something I had not let myself feel since the night I sat beside Margaret's hospital bed all those years ago. Not fear of dying. A man my age makes peace with that possibility more than younger folks understand. It was something closer to the fear of failing, of not being enough, alone out here in the dark, with a storm doing in one night what men in gray suits had been trying to accomplish for weeks. I thought about going inside. I thought about Ray Coleman's advice about cameras and evidence and letting the proper channels handle what proper channels are meant to handle. But the maple groaned again, louder this time, and I understood that whatever decision I made in the next few minutes was not going to wait for daylight, or for anyone else to arrive and make it easier. I moved toward the shed anyway, flashlight cutting a thin, unsteady beam through sheets of rain, my boots sliding in mud that had not existed 3 hours earlier. And somewhere above, the wind and the thunder and the groan of that dying tree, I found myself praying, out loud, the way I had not prayed since kneeling beside Pastor Thomas 2 days before. "Lord," I said, my voice swallowed almost immediately by the storm, "I don't know what tonight is going to cost me, but I am asking you to stand with me in it the way you've stood with this family through every harvest we've ever brought in." The wind answered with another gust hard enough to stagger me sideways, and the maple, already tearing free of its roots, began its final lean toward the ground, toward the shed, toward the exact patch of earth I was currently crossing in the dark. Caleb told me that in the darkness of that office, with the storm screaming against the windows, and Grady Owens fumbling for his phone to find a flashlight app, something in him went suddenly completely clear. He stood up. "Caleb," Grady said, his voice carrying an edge now, the polish finally cracking under pressure, the way cheap varnish does when the wood beneath it starts to swell. "Sit back down. We can finish this in 5 minutes. The power will be back any second." "I'm not signing," Caleb said, and he told me. His own voice surprised him. Steadier than he expected. Steadier than he had sounded in weeks. "Not tonight. Not ever." He did not wait for Grady's response. He told me he simply found the door by memory more than sight, and walked out into a hallway lit only by dim emergency lighting, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, he heard Grady's voice rise sharp and urgent now, calling his name. But Caleb did not slow down. He told me it was the first time in months he had walked away from something without looking back to see how it landed. He reached his truck in the parking garage soaked through before he even made it outside. Rain finding its way through the structure's open sides, driven nearly horizontal by wind gusts strong enough to rock the vehicle on its suspension. While he sat there for 1 full second, hands on the wheel, catching his breath. Then he thought of me. Alone at the orchard, in this. He told me later that the thought hit him like a physical blow, sudden and complete. The understanding that his father was 40 miles away in the heart of this storm, with no one else out there. That whatever protection those cameras offered against a man in a gray suit meant nothing against wind and lightning and falling trees. He started the truck and pulled out of the garage into a night that had turned genuinely dangerous. Rain coming down in sheets, so heavy his headlights barely cut 10 feet ahead. The wipers on their highest setting doing almost nothing against the volume of water sliding across the windshield. The drive should have taken 40 minutes. Caleb told me it felt like 4 hours. Twice he had to stop the truck entirely, waiting out gusts strong enough to visibly rock the vehicle, watching branches and debris tumble across the road in his headlights, like something out of a nightmare. Once navigating a low stretch of county road that flooded easily even in ordinary rain, he found the water already halfway up his tires, and he sat there for a long, terrifying moment, deciding whether to risk it or turn back, before gritting his teeth and pushing forward, praying the whole way through that the engine would not stall in the deepest part of the crossing. He told me he thought about a lot of things on that drive. About Danielle waiting at home, who had told him before he left for the office that whatever he decided, she would stand with him either way. Which was, he said, the first time in a long while he had felt like they were actually on the same side of something. He thought about the $15,000 he still owed. About the fact that walking away from Grady's contract meant that debt was now entirely, terrifyingly, his own to solve. He thought about his mother, about 100 small memories he had not let himself visit in years, memories that had somehow all surfaced at once in the space of one darkened office. But mostly, he told me, he thought about the last conversation he'd had with me in that kitchen, about the way I had said his mother's grave was not his to sell, and about the shame that had followed him every day since. Shame he had been trying to outrun with excuses about pressure and expectations and Danielle's family. When the truth, plain and simple, was that he had been willing to trade away everything that actually mattered for the appearance of having made it. He was not going to let that be the last thing standing between us. Not tonight. The county road narrowed as it approached the turnoff for our property. Trees pressing close on either side, and Caleb told me the wind seemed to intensify the closer he got, as though the storm itself understood he was racing against something and had decided to make the race harder. Branches littered the gravel drive leading up to the house, forcing him to slow to a crawl. His headlights sweeping across a landscape that looked nothing like the orchard he had grown up in. Trees bent nearly sideways under the force of the wind, the old barn roof flapping loose in one corner where a section of tin had already torn free. He did not see me in the yard. He did not see the house lights on, though that meant little given the outage that had likely reached us both by then. He pulled the truck to a stop near the equipment shed, threw the door open into wind that nearly tore it from his hand, and stepped out into the full violence of the storm. His flashlight beam sweeping desperately across the darkened property, searching for any sign of his father. And then, through the sheeting rain, lit for one brief second by a flash of lightning that split the sky directly overhead, he saw it. The old maple, already torn loose from the saturated earth in the final seconds of its long, groaning fall. And beneath it, moving too slowly, too far from cover, a figure he recognized instantly, even through the storm. "Dad!" Caleb screamed the word, tearing from his throat and vanishing almost instantly into the wind. And he ran. I heard my name before I understood why it mattered. The wind was screaming loud enough that I should not have heard anything at all. But a father's ear finds his child's voice in ways science has never fully explained. And I turned toward the sound just as the sky lit silver white above me. That was when I saw it. Not the maple falling. The maple, already falling its full weight, committed its long trunk, sweeping down through the rain like something ancient, finally giving up its fight. I had less than a second to move. I want to be honest and say I do not remember deciding anything. My body simply threw itself sideways, muscle memory older than thought, the same instinct that once made me yank my hand back from a spinning saw blade decades ago, before my mind had even registered the danger. I hit the mud hard shoulder first, air driven out of my lungs in one ragged burst, and the world became noise. A crack like the earth splitting open, a rush of displaced air that slammed against me even from several feet away. Water and debris raining down as the outer branches of the maple crashed into the ground where I had been standing one heartbeat earlier. For a moment I could not tell if I was hurt. I could not tell much of anything lying face down in the mud with rain hammering against my back and my ears ringing from the impact. Then hands were on me. Caleb's hands, gripping my shoulders, hauling me backward and up with a strength born entirely of terror. "Dad! Dad, look at me! Are you hit? Are you hurt?" I could not answer right away. I was still trying to remember how breathing worked. Caleb did not wait for words. He pulled me further from the fallen tree, both of us sliding in mud that had gone to soup, rain plastering his hair flat against his skull. His eyes wide and wild in a way I had not seen since he was a boy, waking from a nightmare. "I'm all right," I finally managed, my voice cracking rougher than the storm around us. "I'm all right, son." He did not seem to believe me. He kept his hands on me, checking my arms, my shoulders, patting down my ribs with a rough urgency that told me exactly how close he believed he had come to losing something he could not get back. Above us, the maple lay across the very ground I had crossed moments before, one massive limb having sheared clean through the corner of the equipment shed roof, tin siding folded like paper. A few feet closer, and there would have been no question of what that tree had done. "What are you doing out here?" I shouted over the wind, gripping his forearm, now needing to feel that he was real. that this was not some fevered trick of adrenaline and fear. "Caleb! The contract! The deadline!" "I didn't sign it!" he shouted back, rain running down his face in sheets that made it impossible to tell where the storm ended and something else began. "Dad, I didn't sign anything. I got in the truck and I came home." I stared at him for a long moment, the two of us kneeling together in the mud with a fallen tree beside us and the storm still raging overhead. And something in my chest broke open that had been sealed shut for weeks. Maybe longer than that. Maybe since the day I first saw that photograph on the internet. "We need to get inside," I said, finally, my voice unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Both of us. Now. We helped each other up, two men soaked through and shaking, leaning against one another, as much for balance as for anything else. And we made our way toward the house, through wind that had not lessened at all, through rain that showed no sign of easing before morning. But something had changed in the walk between where that tree fell and where the porch light waited for us, dark now from the outage, but somehow still a beacon in my mind, the promise of shelter and warmth, and a conversation neither of us had been ready to have until tonight forced it out of us both. We reached the porch steps together, and Caleb stopped there for a moment, rain streaming off him, his hand still gripping my arm. "I almost lost you," he said, and his voice broke completely on the last word. "I almost lost everything that actually matters, chasing something that never would have mattered at all." I looked at my son, standing there in the storm, soaked and shaking, and more honest with me than he had been in years. And I understood, standing on those porch steps with a fallen tree behind us, and a ruined shed roof, and 40 acres still standing despite everything thrown against them, that whatever this storm had cost us in wood and tin and torn fencing, it had given something back that I had feared was gone for good. I pulled him into my arms right there on the steps, both of us soaked and trembling. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. There was only the rain and the wind beginning finally to ease, and the sound of my son crying against my shoulder, the way he had not cried since he was small enough for me to carry him through these very fields. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 candles burning between us, the power still out. The storm outside settling into a steady, exhausted rain that no longer rattled the windows the way it had an hour before. I had found towels for us both, and a bottle of the good scotch I kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, for occasions I rarely admitted to myself I was saving it for. I poured 2 glasses, though Caleb barely touched his, turning it slowly between his hands, as though the motion itself was steadying him. "I should have told you about the advance the day I took it," he said finally, his voice still rough from the cold and everything else the night had asked of him. "I kept telling myself I'd find a way to fix it before you ever had to know. That's the truth, Dad. I wasn't trying to protect you. I was trying to protect myself from having this exact conversation." I turned my glass slowly on the table, watching the candlelight catch in the amber liquid. And I thought for a long moment before I answered, because I had learned, somewhere over the last 69 years, that the words spoken in the hour right after a crisis matter more than almost any other words a man says in his life. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt," I said. "Finding out about that land the way I did. Sitting across this table from you and hearing you'd already signed something with a stranger before you ever thought to sign anything with me. That cut deep, son. Deeper than I think I let myself admit even to Pastor Thomas this week." Caleb's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly, accepting it, the way a man accepts a diagnosis he already suspected but had been avoiding. "But I want you to hear something else, too," I continued. "Your mother used to say that the measure of a man isn't whether he falls. Every man falls sooner or later over something. The measure is what he does in the moment right after, when he's still lying in the mud and has to decide whether to stay down or get back up. I almost didn't get up, Caleb said quietly. I was sitting in that office with the pen in my hand, Dad. I was seconds away. But you didn't sign it, I said. You set the pen down. You drove 40 miles through the worst storm this county's seen in a decade, and you didn't do it to save the land. You did it because somewhere in that darkness, you remembered what actually mattered. Caleb looked down at his glass, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. I heard her, Dad. In that office right before the lights went out. I heard Mom's voice clear as anything, saying the same thing she told Danielle years ago at Thanksgiving. That the orchard doesn't belong to our family. That our family belongs to the orchard. I felt something tighten in my throat, and I did not try to hide it from him, because I had spent enough years hiding things from my son already, and tonight did not feel like a night for more of that. She used to say that to me too, I said. The week we closed on this place back before you were born, I was terrified we'd taken on more than we could handle, and she sat me down right at this very table and told me the same thing. That we weren't buying land. We were being given a responsibility, and it would outlast both of us if we honored it right. We sat quiet for a while after that, listening to the rain easing outside, to the occasional groan of the old house settling around us. And I found myself studying my son's face in the candlelight, seeing for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, not the man who had almost sold his mother's grave to a stranger, but the boy who used to ride on my shoulders through these very rows, who used to ask me 100 questions about why the trees needed pruning, and how deep the well went, and whether apples ever got tired of growing. I still owe them $15,000, Caleb said after a while, his voice quieter now, more tired than defensive. That doesn't just disappear because I didn't sign the second contract. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But we'll figure that out together, son. That's a debt. It's not your soul. There's a difference. And I think tonight, you finally understand it. He looked up at me then, and something in his expression reminded me so completely of the boy he had once been, that I had to look away for a moment, out toward the dark window, toward an orchard I could not see but knew was still standing out there in the settling rain, battered, but not broken. Why didn't you fight dirty? Caleb asked suddenly. You had every right to. You could have gone after me the way Grady went after us. You could have used the fence, the trees, all of it to force my hand. Instead, you just waited. You prayed. You went to church. Why? I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered. Because it deserved a real answer, not a quick or easy one. Because your mother didn't raise the kind of man who wins by becoming the thing he's fighting against, I said finally. I could have called a lawyer the day I saw that sign. I could have threatened you the way Grady threatened us both. But that's not faith, Caleb. That's just fear wearing a different suit. I chose to trust that if I stayed steady, stayed faithful, the truth would find its way to you eventually. Tonight, it did. Outside, the rain had finally slowed to something gentler, almost peaceful. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the first tentative call of a bird, uncertain whether the storm had truly passed, but willing to test the silence anyway. Get some sleep, I said, standing slowly, my body aching in a dozen places I would feel far worse of come morning. Tomorrow we've got a fence to fix, a shed roof to patch, and a man in a gray suit who's going to have some questions to answer. Caleb managed something close to a smile, tired and worn but genuine. The first real one I had seen from him in longer than I could remember. Tomorrow, he agreed. Morning came, clear and cold, the particular brightness that always follows a bad storm, as though the sky itself needed to apologize for what it had done overnight. Caleb and I walked out together just after 7, surveying the damage in the pale light. The maple lay across the shed roof exactly as it had fallen, tin siding crumpled beneath its weight. Branches and debris littered the yard. The south fence, already weakened by whatever had cut it days before, had given way entirely in two more places. Wire lying tangled in the mud, like something the storm had tried to strangle. We had barely started clearing the worst of it when I heard tires on the gravel drive, and I turned to see the black sedan pulling to a stop near the gate. Unhurried, as though its driver had all the time in the world. Grady Owens stepped out in a coat far too clean for the mess surrounding us, his shoes already picking their way carefully around the puddles. And I felt Caleb straighten beside me, his shoulders squaring in a way I had not seen from him since he played linebacker in high school, bracing for impact before it arrived. "Quite a night," Grady said, surveying the fallen tree, the torn shed roof, with an expression that struck me as far too composed for a man looking at destruction he had no hand in causing. "I hope everyone's all right out here." "Say what you came to say," I told him, my voice steady despite the exhaustion still sitting heavy in my bones. Grady's eyes moved to Caleb, and something flickered there. Irritation, perhaps, or the particular disappointment of a man watching an investment walk itself off a cliff. "Caleb, I have to say leaving that office last night without a word was unprofessional. We had a deadline. That deadline has now passed." "I'm not signing anything," Caleb said, and his voice carried a steadiness I had not heard from him in this fight until now. The voice of a man who had made his decision in the dark and had no intention of revisiting it in daylight. "Not the land agreement, not anything else with your company." "Then we'll need to discuss the repayment of the advance," Grady said smoothly, already reaching into his coat, ever ready with paperwork. $15,000, plus the penalty clause for breach of the good faith timeline, which, as you'll recall from the agreement you signed. "Before you go any further," I interrupted, "I'd like to ask you about something else. A piece of paper I found out past my fence line last week." Grady's hand paused halfway to producing whatever document he had been about to unfold, and for the briefest moment, something passed across his face that no amount of practiced composure could fully smooth away. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said. "2 words," I said, watching him closely now, the way I used to watch numbers on a spreadsheet for the small discrepancy that told me a larger story was hiding underneath. Phase 2. Written in pencil, left near 6 of my trees that somebody had taken the trouble to girdle with a knife. Trees that don't die quickly, Mr. Owens. They die slowly, over a season or two. The same way a business relationship dies when one side keeps applying quiet pressure while smiling the whole time. "I have no idea what that would have to do with my company," Grady said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness, tightening at the edges the way a rope tightens right before it frays. Caleb stepped forward then, closer to Grady than I expected, his jaw set hard. "You mentioned the fence line, Grady. Last night on the phone with me, right before the deadline you moved up to Friday. You said, and I quote, 'I'd hate for anything else to happen to that land while we're all still trying to sort out these details.' Anything else. Not anything else." The word hung in the cold morning air between us, and I watched something shift in Grady's expression. The practiced calm cracking just slightly at the edges. Enough for a man who had spent 40 years reading boardrooms to see the truth underneath it. "That's not an admission of anything," Grady said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned considerably. "No," I agreed, "but it's the kind of detail a jury tends to find interesting, especially alongside 4 cameras I installed around this property last week, and a sheriff's deputy who's already asked around town about black sedans seen out this way at night." Grady's eyes moved between the two of us, calculating, and for the first time since he had stepped out of his car, I saw something in him that looked less like a predator and more like a man realizing too late that the ground beneath him had shifted while he was still congratulating himself on the terrain. "This land has outlived men like you before," I said quietly. stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my son. My grandfather bought the first 20 acres of it from a bank that tried to cheat him out of half the deed. My father held on to it through a decade that put half the farms in this county under. It's outlived droughts, outlived debt, outlived every man who ever looked at it and saw dollar signs instead of roots. It'll outlive you, too. For a long moment, Grady said nothing at all. Then in the distance, coming up the gravel drive behind his sedan, I saw a second vehicle, approaching, lights bar dark, but unmistakable in its shape. And I watched Grady's gaze flick toward it, watched something in his posture go rigid in a way it had not been rigid all morning. Deputy Ray Coleman's cruiser rolled to a stop behind the black sedan, and Ray stepped out slowly, a folder tucked beneath one arm, his expression carrying the particular seriousness of a man who has come to deliver news he considers overdue. "Mr. Owens," Ray said, walking toward us with unhurried purpose. "I'm going to need a few minutes of your time. Seems some interesting footage came through from a property camera system a few counties over, tied to a company matching your firm's description. I think we should talk." Grady looked from Ray to Caleb to me, and in that moment, standing in the mud and wreckage of the night before, I watched the last of his practiced composure finally completely fail him. "I don't know what footage you think you have," Grady said. But the words came out thinner than anything he had said all morning, the practiced smoothness finally abandoning him entirely. "My firm operates within the law, Deputy. I'd be careful about accusations you can't substantiate." Ray opened the folder without hurry, the kind of unhurried patience that comes from a man who has already done his homework and is simply enjoying, in a quiet professional way, watching the pieces land where they belong. "Camera footage from a property 2 counties over," Ray said, "belonging to a family named Pruitt, who I understand declined a purchase offer from Summit Ridge back in the spring. Shows a man matching your description, along with a black sedan matching your plates, parked near their fence line at 11 at night, 3 days before 6 of their fruit trees turned up girdled. Sheriff over there has been building a file for months. Wasn't hard connecting it to what happened here once Deputy here made a call." I watched Grady's face carefully as Ray spoke, watched the color drain from it in slow, undeniable increments. And beside me, I felt Caleb go very still, absorbing the full weight of what this meant. Not one incident, a pattern, a method refined and repeated, used against families who had made the same mistake we nearly had, trusting a smile and a firm handshake over their own instincts. "This is a misunderstanding," Grady said, though his voice had lost whatever conviction it once carried. "I was scouting comparable properties. That's standard practice in this industry." "At 11 at night?" Ray said. "With bolt cutters in your trunk, according to the Pruitt's camera, which caught a rather clear angle of you retrieving something from your vehicle, before walking toward their fence line. We'll let a judge sort out what standard practice looks like." Grady's eyes moved once more between the 3 of us, and I watched something in him finally completely collapse the mask he had worn since the first morning he stepped onto my property, dissolving into something far less composed, far more desperate. "Caleb," he said, turning toward my son with something almost like pleading in his voice, "you understand this is just business. Summit Ridge simply identifies undervalued land and facilitates transactions that benefit—" "Save it," Caleb said, and his voice carried a firmness I had not heard from him in years, not since he was young enough to still believe the world worked the way his mother had taught him it should. "You threatened my father. You destroyed his trees. You used my debt to try and force a family apart. There's no version of business that makes that acceptable, and I'm done pretending I didn't understand what was happening the whole time." Ray stepped forward then, producing a second document from his folder, official in its formatting in a way that made even the morning air feel more solemn. "Mr. Owens, I'm going to need you to come down to the station with me. This isn't an arrest, not yet. But given the pattern we're seeing across multiple counties, the county prosecutor's office is going to want to talk to you directly. And I'd strongly recommend you have a lawyer present when that conversation happens." For a long moment, Grady said nothing at all. He looked out at the orchard behind us, at the fallen maple still lying across the shed roof, at the torn fence line still glistening with last night's rain, and something in his expression, just for a second, looked almost like genuine regret. Though I could not tell if it was regret for what he had done, or simply regret at having been caught doing it. "This isn't over," he said finally, though the threat in it had curdled into something closer to a man trying to save face on his way out the door. "Summit Ridge has resources, lawyers. This will get resolved." "I imagine it will," I said quietly. "One way or another." I watched something register in his eyes at hearing his own words handed back to him. And without another word, he turned and walked toward Ray's cruiser. His earlier confident stride, now something smaller, more careful. A man measuring his steps, the way people do when the ground has stopped feeling solid beneath them. Ray paused before following him, turning back to us with an expression that carried something warmer than the professional distance he had maintained through the confrontation. "Earl Caleb," he said. "I'll need statements from both of you at some point, but there's no rush today. Get your property back in order first. Storm did enough damage without adding paperwork to the list." "Thank you, Ray," I said, and I meant it more deeply than the simple words could carry. Grateful not just for his diligence, but for the particular kind of decency that had made him drive 2 counties over to connect threads most men in his position would never have bothered chasing. We stood together, Caleb and I, watching the cruiser pull away down the gravel drive, with Grady's sedan following slowly behind it. And for a long moment, after both vehicles disappeared past the tree line, neither of us said anything at all. "It's over," Caleb said finally, though there was something uncertain in the way he said it, as though he was testing whether the words were true by speaking them aloud. "The part with him is over," I said, looking out at the wreckage of fence and fallen tree and torn shed roof still waiting for us in the morning light. "We've still got a fence to mend and $15,000 between us to figure out, and a whole harvest sitting out there that isn't going to pick itself." Caleb managed something close to a laugh, tired but genuine, and he clapped a hand on my shoulder, the way he used to, when he was young enough to think that gesture alone could fix whatever had gone wrong between us. "Then I guess we'd better get to work," he said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, standing in the mud and debris of a storm that had nearly taken everything, and somehow instead given something back, I found myself agreeing with him completely. 3 weeks passed before the orchard was ready to give up its harvest. 3 weeks of mended fences and a patched shed roof of insurance adjusters and county paperwork. Of Caleb driving out most mornings before his shift at the plant to help me finish what the storm had started and Grady Owens had tried to accelerate. We did not speak much of Summit Ridge in those weeks. Word came through Ray Coleman that the company was under formal investigation across 4 counties now that Grady Owens had lawyered up the way men like him always do when the ground finally gives out beneath their feet. And that seemed enough for both of us. Some victories do not need celebrating so much as simply acknowledging, quietly, and then setting aside to make room for the work still waiting. The $15,000 remained a debt neither of us pretended had vanished. Caleb had taken on extra shifts at the plant, and I had opened an account to help him chip away at it steadily, not as a bailout, but as what Pastor Thomas called, when I mentioned it to him one Sunday, an act of restoration rather than rescue. Caleb insisted on tracking every payment himself, insisted on seeing the balance shrink with his own labor behind it, and I did not argue with him about that. A man rebuilding his own foundation needs to feel the weight of every board he sets in place. The morning of the harvest came. Clear and cool, early October sunlight slanting gold through rows of trees heavier with fruit than I had seen in years. As though the orchard itself understood what this particular crop had cost us and had decided to be generous in return. Word had gotten around Millbrook the way word does in a town this size, and by 7 that morning, more hands had shown up than I had any right to expect. Pastor Thomas was there, sleeves rolled up despite his 60-some years, working alongside Ray Coleman, who had traded his uniform for old jeans and a flannel shirt not so different from my own. Danny Ostrander came from the hardware store with his father, both of them carrying baskets before I had even finished my coffee. Danielle arrived with a cooler full of sandwiches and lemonade, setting up a table near the old oak where folks could rest between rows. And I watched my son work beside her, easy and unguarded, in a way I had not seen from him since he was a boy. We worked through the morning in a rhythm that felt older than any of us. The particular music of baskets filling, and ladders shifting, and voices calling back and forth between rows, punctuated by laughter that had nothing forced about it. I found myself more than once simply standing still for a moment among the trees, watching neighbors I had known my whole life move through rows. Margaret and I had planted together, and feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as gratitude, too large to hold quietly. Near midday, Caleb found me at the edge of the north field, both of us pausing to eat sandwiches Danielle had made, sitting on the tailgate of my truck, the way we used to when he was young enough to think riding along on harvest days was the greatest adventure available to him. "I've been thinking about something," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "About what you said that first morning, that the land wasn't yours to sell because it was Mom's." "I remember," I said. "I never really understood what that meant until this month," he said. "I thought it meant the deed, or the legal ownership, something like that. But it's not about paperwork at all, is it? It's about what she put into it. What you put into it. What all of this is supposed to keep meaning long after both of you are gone." I looked at my son for a long moment, watching sunlight move through the leaves above us, watching the particular way he had started to carry himself since that night in the storm. Steadier now, more grounded. A man finally standing on solid footing after months of shifting sand. "There's somewhere I think you should go," I said, before we finished the day. I did not need to explain further. Caleb understood immediately, the way sons often understand their fathers in moments that matter most, without either of them needing to spell it out entirely. He set down what remained of his sandwich, wiped his hands once more, and together we walked the quarter-mile to the edge of the property, past rows heavy with fruit, past the sound of neighbors working and laughing behind us, toward the old oak standing at the field's edge. Its branches bare of fruit as they had always been, its roots reaching deep into soil that held more of our family's history than any deed or document ever could. The oak stood the way it always had, wide and unhurried, its branches bare of fruit but heavy with 100 years of shade. Its roots reaching down into ground that held more of my family's story than any single page could carry. The small stone marker at its base had weathered, soft at the edges now. Margaret's name and dates worn gentle by 38 winters. Though someone, likely me, on some afternoon I no longer remembered clearly, had kept the grass trimmed close around it. Kept it from disappearing into the field the way untended things eventually do. Caleb stopped a few feet short of the stone, and I watched something in him hesitate. The particular reluctance of a man approaching a reckoning he has avoided for longer than he wants to admit. "Go on," I said quietly, stepping back to give him room. "I'll be right here." He knelt slowly in the grass, his knees sinking into ground still soft from the storm weeks before. And for a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply resting his hand against the cool stone, the way a man might rest his hand against another person's shoulder, seeking some contact that words alone could not provide. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said finally, his voice low, unsteady in a way I had rarely heard from my grown son. "I don't know how any of this works, whether you're watching, whether it even matters what I say out here. But I need to say it anyway." He was quiet again, and I stood a respectful distance behind him, watching the wind move gentle through the branches above, watching sunlight scatter across the grass in shifting patterns that felt in that moment less like coincidence and more like company. "I almost sold it, Mom," Caleb said, and his voice cracked fully now, the words coming rougher, more honest than anything I had heard him say in the weeks before. "I almost sold the land you and Dad built with nothing but stubbornness and 40 years of hard mornings. I told myself I was doing it for my family, for Danielle, for a future I thought I had to buy instead of build. But the truth is, I was scared, and I was ashamed of what I didn't have. And I let a stranger convince me that shame was worth more than everything you actually gave me." He pressed his palm flatter against the stone, and I saw his shoulders begin to shake. Quiet and contained at first, then less so. The particular grief of a man finally releasing something he had been carrying, silent and heavy, for far too long. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I forgot what you taught me. I'm sorry it took almost losing Dad in a storm to remember it. I promise you I won't forget again. Whatever this land asks of me from here on, I'll give it. I owe you that much, and I owe him that much. And I think somewhere along the way, I finally understand that I owe myself that much too." I moved forward then, unable to hold the distance any longer, and I knelt beside my son in the damp grass, placing my own hand on the stone beside his, our fingers nearly touching over the worn letters of her name. "She'd be proud of you," I said quietly. "Not because you never fell, because of what you did once you were back on your feet." We knelt there together for a long while, father and son, saying nothing more, letting the wind and the distant sounds of the harvest laughter, carrying faint from the rows behind us, fill the silence in a way that felt complete rather than empty. I thought about Pastor Thomas's words from weeks before, about how faith rarely promises victory, so much as it promises presence. The assurance that we are never asked to carry our burdens entirely alone. After a while, Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked up at me, something lighter in his expression than I had seen there in a very long time. "Should we head back?" he asked. "Pastor Thomas said something about wanting to say a blessing before we finish loading the last of the crates." "I think that would be right," I said, helping him to his feet, both of us brushing damp grass from our knees. "Your mother always did like it when the harvest ended with a proper thank you." We walked back together through the rows, the afternoon light softening now toward evening, and ahead of us I could see the others gathering near the old equipment shed. Its roof freshly patched, crates stacked high with fruit that had very nearly never made it to harvest at all. Pastor Thomas stood near the center of the small crowd, and when he saw us approaching, he raised a hand in quiet greeting, understanding without needing to ask where we had been and what it had cost us to go there. By the time we reached the equipment shed, the last of the crates had been stacked and covered, rows upon rows of apples gleaming red and gold in the fading afternoon light. More fruit than I had brought in during any harvest in the past 5 years combined. Nearly 30 people stood gathered in a loose circle near the shed. Neighbors and friends who had given up their Saturday for nothing more than the simple decency of helping one of their own. And I felt something in my chest swell at the sight of them, humbled in a way that success alone had never once made me feel. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, as Caleb and I joined the circle, his weathered face catching the last warm light of the day. And he did not need to ask us to gather closer. People simply understood the way small towns understand these things without much explanation. And hands began reaching for the hands beside them, forming a loose, unbroken ring around the crates and the shed, and the whole hard-won harvest. "Lord," Pastor Thomas began, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air, "we come to you today with hands calloused and backs tired, the way your people have come to you every harvest season since the beginning of time. We thank you for this fruit, for the rain that nearly took it, and instead, in your mercy, gave it room to ripen fully. We thank you for neighbors willing to labor beside one another without asking anything in return." I felt Caleb's hand tighten slightly in mine, and beside him, Danielle's fingers laced through his other hand. Her eyes closed, her lips moving faintly along with words she had clearly carried with her longer than I had realized. "We thank you especially," Pastor Thomas continued, "for restoration. For a father who chose patience over vengeance, and a son who chose truth over fear, even when truth cost him everything he thought he needed to hold on to. Lord, there is no harvest sweeter than the one that comes after a family finds its way back to solid ground. We ask that you continue to bless this land, this family, and everyone gathered here who understands that the real wealth of a life is measured not in what we keep, but in what we're willing to give and to forgive." A soft chorus of amens moved through the circle, quiet and unhurried, and for a long moment afterward, nobody spoke at all, simply standing together in the golden light, with the smell of ripe apples and turned earth settling over everything like a blessing of its own. As the circle began to loosen, people drifting toward the tables Danielle had set up, toward conversation and lemonade, and the particular contentment that follows honest labor, I felt Caleb's hand slip from mine, and I turned to find him watching me with an expression I recognized from decades of fatherhood. The particular look of a son waiting for his father to say something. He already suspects his coming. "Walk with me a minute," I said, and we stepped away from the gathering toward the quiet edge of the yard where the last of the day's light fell soft and orange across the grass. I reached into my jacket pocket, the same canvas coat I had worn the night I first saw the sign, in that photograph weeks ago now, though it felt considerably longer, and I withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief that had once belonged to my own father. "This was your grandfather's," I said, unwrapping it carefully, revealing a pocket watch, worn smooth with age, its brass casing dulled by decades of hands passing it from one generation to the next. "He gave it to me the week your mother and I closed on this land. Told me a man needed something to remind him that time on good soil is never wasted, no matter how hard the season gets." Caleb stared at the watch, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed, understanding immediately the weight of what I was offering him. "I always thought you'd keep this," he said quietly. "I did keep it," I said, "for 38 years. But a thing like this isn't meant to sit in a drawer waiting for a funeral, son. It's meant to be carried by someone still walking forward, someone who understands now what it actually costs to hold on to what matters." I placed the watch in his open palm, closing his fingers gently around it, the way I used to close his small hand around a baseball glove decades ago, teaching him something I hoped would outlast the lesson itself. "I won't let you down again," Caleb said, his voice thick, the watch warm now in his grip. "I know," I said, and for the first time since that photograph appeared on my phone weeks before, I found I believed it completely. The sun finished setting while we stood there, the sky turning the particular deep orange that only comes at the end of an October day. And behind us, I could hear the gathering continuing, without needing either of us to tend it. laughter and conversation carrying warm across the yard, the sound of a community that had shown up not because they owed us anything, but because that is simply what neighbors do when the harvest is worth saving. I have thought a great deal in the weeks since that storm about what it means to hold on to something. I spent most of my life believing that protecting what mattered meant gripping it tighter, fighting harder, refusing to let go no matter the cost. But I understand now that holding on the right way looks less like a closed fist and more like an open hand, steady enough to offer what you have, patient enough to trust that faithfulness matters more than force. My son did not come back to me because I threatened him into it. He came back because somewhere in the middle of a storm, in the darkest room he had ever sat in, he remembered who he actually wanted to be. And he chose it on his own, the way every real change in a person has to be chosen. That, I believe, is the harder lesson underneath this whole ordeal. We cannot force the people we love to see clearly. We can only stay faithful long enough and steady enough that when they are finally ready to look, we are still standing where they left us. I think about Margaret often these days, more than usual. And I find myself grateful in a way that surprises me. Grateful not just for the years we had together, but for the roots she left behind in this soil and in our son. Roots deep enough to hold, even when the wind tried its hardest to tear everything loose. I believe she was watching that night in the storm, in whatever way the faithful departed watch over the ones they love. And I believe she was proud, not because nothing was ever nearly lost, but because of what we found on the other side of nearly losing it. If you have a son or a daughter who has drifted, who has let fear or pride or somebody else's expectations pull them toward a decision you know in your heart isn't really them, I would ask you to consider patience before punishment. Not because the hurt isn't real, it is, but because faithfulness, planted deep enough and tended long enough, has a way of outlasting even our worst mistakes, the same way an orchard outlasts any single hard season. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own harvest, your own hard-won reconciliation, or your own hope for one still waiting to come, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and what this land or your land has taught you about holding on the right way. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this one, stories where faith and family and hard ground somehow find their way back to good soil, consider following along for what comes next. The last of the daylight faded behind the tree line, and somewhere out past the shed, I could hear Caleb laughing at something Danny Ostrander had said. Easy and unguarded, the sound of a man finally standing solid on ground he had nearly given away. I stood there a moment longer, watching my family and my neighbors gathered together under the darkening October sky, and I said a quiet word of thanks, the kind that needs no audience, but the one who has walked every row of this orchard, alongside me, since the day I first broke this ground. The harvest was in. The land was still ours. And for the first time in a long while, so was my son. I never raised my voice. I never fought dirty. I stayed steady, protected what was entrusted to me, and let the truth do the rest. In the end, I didn't just keep the land. I got my son back. If you were in my place, would you have had that kind of patience? Tell me in the comments, along with where you're listening from. And subscribe, because tomorrow night, another quiet man gets his justice.